Hello and welcome to the Living Room Disciple podcast. We've got a special episode for you today as we welcome in our first guest, Ian Harber. Ian is a writer and author, currently writing a book called Deconstruct Reconstruct that will be out next year. And he's also a social media manager who's active on social media, and here's what I love about Ian. He is writing about questions that real people are asking. So today we're talking to Ian about his story, what brought him to write a book about deconstruction and reconstruction, and what role formation plays when we find ourselves in a crisis of faith. Ian speaks to difficult issues with mercy and tenderness, and we hope today's conversation will be an encouragement to those wrestling with their faith and an encouragement for others to walk alongside those who are struggling. So let's dive into this episode of the Living Room Disciple, where discipleship finds a home. Well, hello and welcome into the Living Room Disciple podcast. We have got a great episode for you today because we are with a special guest, Ian Harber. Ian, welcome to the Living Room Disciple.
Hey, Nick. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me on, and I'm excited for this podcast. What you've told me about it, it sounds amazing, and I'm excited for you guys to get going on it.
Yeah, thank you so much. We are excited too, and excited to have you as one of our first guests. I was just telling you that you were the first person I thought of as a guest for this podcast because the way you have spoken online and written on your Substack about spiritual formation and the way things form us in the world just seemed to fit so hand in glove with our vision for this podcast. And so grateful to have you here. And on that note, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I live just north of Dallas in Texas, and I grew up in a Christian family for the most part. When I was really, really young, my parents were way too young to have me and just made every mistake you can make when I was really young. And so when I was 3.5 is when I came to live with my grandparents in north of Dallas, where I live now. And then they raised me in a Christian home, right? So from very early on, even though that 3.5 year period wasn't that long, it was my first few years, I just growing up with my grandparents, and they never hid anything from me. Obviously, maybe some more of the salacious details of my parents' lives, but like the general arc of what happened, they never really hid anything from me. So I always kind of grew up knowing that my family, it was kind of a typical broken family story in a lot of ways. Like it just wasn't the way that it was supposed to be. And that kind of haunted me forever. But growing up in a Christian home, was great. And my grandparents loved the Lord. And I think they did, the absolute best that they could raising me. And I, neither one of them are living anymore, but I wanted to, honor the role that they both played in my faith growing up. One of the things that I know we're going to be talking about is this topic of deconstruction, and the reason that we're talking about it is because that is part of my story. Even growing up with grandparents who absolutely loved me, they did not have to take me in, and they did. There were aspects of the faith environments that I grew up in, whether that was the schools I was in, because I went to Christian schools, or, the church that I was in, that leaned more towards this fundamentalism that made it difficult to have categories, I think, for my faith that were actually helpful for its growth and flourishing, and actually really found themselves rooted in a lot of American culture and a lot of, just kind of, I don't know. Fundamentalism is kind of a loaded word, but I don't know if I have a better word for it than that a lot of times, And so growing up in that, there was a few things that kind of happened in my life at the same time that started to contribute to me eventually deconstructing my faith. So one of those, a lot of it's death, right? A lot of it is just say right off the bat, a lot of it's death in my family. So the day after Christmas, my 8th grade year, my grandmother passed away from cancer, and that was
I'm so sorry.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. So that was kind of my first loss. And again, remember, whenever I say grandparents, you have to think parents, for your average person. And so growing up, losing her day after Christmas, and then that became the first of 12 funerals that I would go to over the span of a little over 2 years. So some of those were family members, some of those were family friends. I lose an uncle to brain cancer. I lose another grandfather to brain cancer as well. Not the one that raised me, but so just different family members, right? And then that kind of culminated with my mom taking her own life at the end of my sophomore year of high school. So this is kind of it's a little confusing, but this is where there's lots of things happening at the same time. So while all that's happening, I go to your typical youth camp and have your Friday night emotional experience, where I ask Jesus to come into my heart, or however you want to phrase that, But it was a very emotional experience. I have no idea to this day how authentic it is. When I had to write my testimony for my church pretty recently now, I said, I don't know when I was saved. It could have been, one of these times. I honestly don't know when that is. But, so like there was that moment. And then I just really had no understanding of the gospel. And so I was saved into a very legalistic faith, kind of, par for the course of the environment that I was in, which quickly led to burnout. I think through all of the deaths that I was experiencing very rapidly, not really having anyone to talk to as I was going through those things, not having any resources in my faith to process what I was experiencing. Slowly but surely, I just started to burn out from the whole thing. And so part of kind of an interesting part of this, especially because I think this is more common now, but just I think my life was kind of a perfect storm for a lot of these things, being raised as an only child and all this stuff, being very online from a very young age, and some things never change. I still am. But I stumbled across one of the original deconversion stories that was ever published on YouTube. Now they're everywhere. It's super easy to find them, but they really weren't back then. This is one of the first ones. And that thing wrecked my faith, absolutely wrecked it, because he was a former Christian who was no longer a Christian for kind of, a variety of reasons. And he went through and kind of systematically took you through these reasons that were all kind of the foundational core pillars of our faith. And it just decimated them. And I had nothing to, it was all new information for me. Nobody had prepared me for that. And I was already kind of like, this is exhausting. Right. So I left the faith and that didn't last too long. I basically just, call myself an atheist or agnostic or whatever for about a year, which isn't that long. There was kind of some time where I was like, man, I do feel like there's more than just nothing. I wasn't super convinced by the nothingness, the nihilism that is atheism that much, And so it was right after my mom passed away that I did have a pretty powerful encounter with the Lord in my room after some weeks of feeling like he was, I don't know. I don't even have a lot of theological language for this stuff, honestly. But I don't know. Just trying to, I felt him trying to get a hold of me, and so I spent the summer reading through the book of Matthew. I got to the end of Matthew, and I remember thinking, I don't know if this Jesus guy is God or not, but he's awesome. And if he's not, I kind of hope he is. If there is a God, I hope he's like Jesus. And so I remember telling God in that moment, I'm not 100% convinced of a lot of this stuff. A lot of the stuff I've learned over the past, however long, now that I've seen, I don't know if I can unsee. And so that's going to be a problem. But if we're going to do this, I want to do it for real. And I remember him thinking I remember him saying, I can work with that. And so that became a very powerful moment for me, that encounter with the Lord. But I kept my word, and thankfully the Lord also kept his word with me. But that kind of took me into some very progressive, very liberal places. And so basically ran right into the arms of Rob Bell and Richard Rohr and Pete Enns and Peter Rollins and just kind of that whole crew. Michael Gungor was on his own journey kind of at that time that kind of led to everything that the liturgist was. That became very influential for me down the road. And so, I definitely called myself a Christian for sure. But nothing about my life, nothing about my beliefs, nothing about anything that you would actually say is Christian looked Christian at all, right? And so that went on for several years, me just kind of deconstructing more and more and more, until there was a kind of a confluence of things that occurred. I think one of the kind of a powerful moment for me, ironically, was back in 2016 when this guy named Donald Trump got elected to president. This thing happened where a lot of people that I sympathized with in the more progressive side of things, a lot of people started deconstructing right around that time because they looked at what was going on at the time and seeing how people that they trusted supported someone that didn't seem worthy of Christians, unabashed support. And so they actually started deconstructing at that point. I had been deconstructing for a very long time at that point. And so what kind of stood out to me was everything that they said, I felt like I agreed with, but I also saw this kind of backlash reaction from a lot of progressives towards conservatives that was very reminiscent of the fundamentalism that I grew up in, right? So it kind of dawned on me that, if you boil us all down, we're all fundamentalists to some degree, right? No side has the corner on the market on truth or even on compassion and love and right. No matter how they try to build themselves, whether that's conservatives as the defenders of truth and liberals as, the loving, compassionate ones, both are an absolute mixed bag and neither have the corner on that. Right. Yeah. So that actually began kind of a reconstruction journey for me, where I thought, this progressivism, this progressive stuff that I've been in, that's not it either. And now I just kind of feel, like I don't really know what to do with myself now. And so that led to me lots of different things. About a year after that, my grandfather passed away in a plane crash, which was absolutely devastating. That's that's the hardest thing that's ever happened to me. And I had just right as he passed away, I had just been accepted into a theological training program at a local church where I was going to go kind of study theology for the first time formally. And I almost didn't do it, but I decided, well, okay, he would want me to do it. I'm going to keep doing it. I think I should. And I need a way to process this stuff. And so we get there on the first day of the training program. One of the teachers stands up and says, we do theology in the light so we can stand out in the dark. And there I was in the darkest moment of my life. And I thought, okay, let's see. I mean, I'm in the dark, so too late, but let's see how this stuff, how this goes. And man, I didn't agree with every single thing that was said in the entire class or whatever, but it was just the historic Orthodox faith. It's really that simple. And I was like, this is what I've been missing. And so this is a foundation that I can rebuild my faith on. So I just took that and just started kind of, use that as a launching point. So, all that to say, so how do we even get here? So, right before the pandemic started, which is several years kind of after all of that had happened, I had the very random opportunity to share some of my story for the Gospel Coalition in an article. And from what I hear, a lot of people read that article, which was surprising to me, with lots of response from it, which I did not think would happen when I wrote that. And then we went into the pandemic, which is crazy. And so since that article happened, I've just sort of found myself in this discussion. I feel like, deconstruction has come to the top of a lot of people's minds over the past 3 years since that article came out, since the pandemic happened and everything else. And so, if I can be helpful in this space, I want to be helpful in it. Not that I have all the answers. I don't feel like I have all the answers. But I feel like I have my story, my journey, things that have been helpful for me and not helpful for me, and also walking with other people who are deconstructing, reconstructing, and, those types of things, because it is everywhere. Like, I have friends who are somewhere in that process right now, all over the place. And so that kind of culminated in just a couple months ago, signing on with InterVarsity Press to write a book on deconstruction and reconstruction for the church. And so that is kind of what I'm working on now. And the main kind of difference in it, there's a lot of really good books that have come out on deconstruction in the past few years. And what I've noticed is they're all kind of talking to people who are deconstructing. And some of them, depending on how they handle it, some of them are kind of, this is how you deconstruct. And some of them are more kind of helpful, processing the experience, I think is really good. But what I want to do is kind of work more as a translator and not talk to people who are deconstructing, but talk to the church and kind of help the church understand, here's what's going on, here's what deconstruction is, here's what it isn't, here's maybe a better, helpful way to be thinking about it. Not that I get to define it once and for all what it is, but if I can help put some words to it that gives kind of a framework and a paradigm for thinking through it, then we can actually, one, walk with people who are in it because we have a better grasp on what they're experiencing and going through. And then two, hopefully shape both our relationships and our churches in ways that lessen the intensity of people's deconstructions and hopefully disciple people towards maturity without this kind of crisis of faith that is deconstruction.
Absolutely.
So that's sort of my story and what I'm up to right now.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for your vulnerability and honesty to share all of that. And that's really the perfect segue into, you're talking about how right now you're in the process of writing this book that's about deconstruction, but also about reconstruction. And so a couple things. First, can you kind of give us a definition of deconstruction, the way you see it? Because the way you've talked about it has been refreshing to me, and I think has been a take that has been a little bit different than some of the harsh ways that it can be often talked about.
Yeah, so again, my definition is not the end-all, be-all, just trying to put helpful language to it, so someone might want to critique it a little bit, and that's totally fine. But the way I've been thinking about deconstruction is this. So I say that deconstruction is a crisis of faith that leads to the questioning of core doctrines and the untangling of cultural ideologies that settles in a faith that is different than before. So it's a little bit of a mouthful. For me, the linchpin of that whole definition is that first part. It's a crisis of faith. I think people kind of look at the other parts of that. They'll look at, the questioning of core doctrines and want to talk about doubt and questioning and those types of things. And yes, absolutely, that's a part of it. Or the untangling of cultural ideologies, and they'll look at American culture and republicanism and all that kind of stuff and go, yep, that's definitely part of it too. But I think if you just look at those without addressing the crisis of faith that it actually is, then you're really missing the broader picture of what it is, and you can start
to meet people where they're at. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, you start to kind of classify it as different things that you're picking up on real things, but not the whole picture, right?
Yes.
And so some people will say that the deconstruction is one step on the way to apostasy. And it's like, well, it could be, you could leave the faith. That is a part of my story. This is a part of people I know's story. That's part of a lot of people's stories, right? You do see lots of stories of people leaving the faith. I wouldn't say that's an inevitable outcome of deconstruction. Right. In fact, when you're deconstructing, you don't know what the outcome is going to be. You're just trying to put one foot in front of the other and see where it takes you, right? Or other people who are more warm and friendly towards deconstruction, they'll say, well, deconstruction is just asking questions about your faith. It's just examining everything and looking at it and trying to, pull it apart and put it back together. And it kind of turns deconstruction into like a science experiment. And, again, yeah, that's part of the process for sure. Like that's what people are doing. But there's like this existential layer to both of those aspects that gets missed a lot, which is, it's a crisis. It's a crisis of faith that feels like a crisis. It feels like you're losing something. It feels like something's being taken away from you. It feels like people don't wake up one day and go, I want to be closer to the Lord. I think I'm going to deconstruct my faith. Like that's just not the process. It's more something that happens to you. You feel something in your gut for a while, and then you kind of wake up one day and it's like a trap door opened up from under you and you fell through. Now you don't know where you are anymore. That to me is deconstruction. That's the experience. And then once you've fallen through that door and you're in that dark room and you don't know where you are anymore, then you've got to ask questions about doctrines. You've got to untangle some cultural stuff. You have to feel your way around in the room to figure out where the light switch is, right? So that's where that other stuff comes in. But that linchpin for me is the crisis.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think as the church, and for those of us as Christians who stand on that orthodox foundation that you were talking about, I think we can often do a better job of weeping with those who weep, mourning with those who mourn, and not, like you said, rushing straight to the doubting of the doctrines, but sit with them in the pain. Sit with them and be Jesus to them, so that they have a concrete example of what that looks like. Because our prayer is that it wouldn't lead to apostasy, as you said, but our prayer is, and this is the second half of the title of your book, right, is that it would lead to reconstruction. And so tell me a little bit about that. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think, the truth of the matter is everyone is going to reconstruct something. That's why the last point, kind of the last part of my definition is that settles in a faith that is different than before. Everybody has a faith, right? Whether even no faith is a faith, as people have famously argued for a while now. And so the question isn't really, are you reconstructing? Are you going to reconstruct? The question is, what are you going to reconstruct in the place of what you had before, right? And so, the trap that I think people get stuck in is, thinking that deconstruction is an end in and of itself, right? Or they get stuck there, and it can be a really long process. My total deconstruction reconstruction process was probably the better part of like 8 to 10 years.
Wow.
So it's a really long. It can be a long thing, right? But I don't think we can be in that perpetual state of deconstruction forever. It's when you're in it. When it happens to you, you have to move through it. You can't short circuit the process to get out of it and relieve that anxiety that you feel being in it. But we have to have a way to find meaning in life, to make meaning in life. And that comes through the stories that we believe, that comes through what we believe about God, that comes through what we believe about the world and ourselves, and how all this stuff fits together. So you will inevitably reconstruct something. What people reconstruct might be vastly different. I hope what we can help provide in the church is kind of what I experienced, which is healthy, helpful ways to re-examine the historic faith that has been passed down to us that we receive, and reconstruct in light of that, rather than some of these other options, I guess you could say, that are out there for us.
Right, absolutely. So this is all super helpful, and I'm sure to somebody listening who's struggled with their faith and been asking these questions, this is super helpful. But like you said at the beginning of this interview, I hope it's also helpful for the church, helpful to people that are looking on as maybe some young people in their church are deconstructing, or they're walking through a crisis of faith with somebody. I hope these answers and these thoughts in this discussion is helpful to them as well. But this is a spiritual formation podcast. We are interested mostly in the question, how is this forming us? So let's kind of pivot to the deconstruction and reconstruction question, but how does it relate to spiritual formation? So first of all, what role would you say that spiritual formation plays in deconstruction?
Yeah, so I think deconstruction is a means to spiritual formation. It's not the only way. A lot of people will say that, you'll hear people say, I wish everybody would deconstruct. And I don't know if I agree with that. Not because I think deconstruction is bad, but because I think deconstruction, when you say that, you're basically wishing a crisis onto people that I don't think has to be necessary, right? I wish, instead of people deconstructing and having to pull apart all of the things that that got tangled up in their faith that are not representative of Jesus, not representative of our faith, that those weren't there, right? But they are there for a lot of people. I would rather us just disciple our people really well from the beginning and have churches that are healthy and safe, and pastors that
for sure
care for their people and all of those things, right? But if you find yourself in that place of deconstruction, I think it's formative for us in a lot of the same ways that suffering is formative for us, right? And this is what makes a lot of this difficult, is because we don't have good categories in our society for the benefits of suffering, which is a weird way to put that, because suffering is bad and we don't want to suffer. And I don't wish suffering on anybody, but the Lord uses suffering to form us spiritually. So like one of my favorite verses recently has been Romans 5, 3-5, where Paul says we actually boast in our afflictions, in our suffering, because we know that affliction produces endurance, and endurance produces proven character, and proven character produces hope. And that's a hope that won't disappoint us because God's love has been poured out in our hearts through the Holy Spirit who is given us. So Paul draws this direct line from the suffering that you experience in life to the experience you have of God's love in your life that's poured out into your heart by the Holy Spirit. And there's a chain that gets you there, right? It's enduring that suffering, persevering through that suffering. It's that builds endurance, that produces character. You are a different person on the other side of suffering than you were on before, because your eyes have been opened, your heart has been softened. You have allowed the Lord to do a work in yourself that now you actually have more hope on the other side of suffering. Some of the most hopeful people are the people that have endured the worst suffering, because they have seen the Lord be faithful to them in it and gracious to them in it, and the kind of person that it has made them, and they actually like themselves better on the other side of suffering than they did before, right? Which is this paradox that we are really uncomfortable with in our culture, right? And so, I think what God does in those times of suffering and of deconstruction is he tears away the things that have taken our gaze off of him. He destroys our idols. He changes our paradigms. He opens our eyes to new ways of seeing and being. And so, in deconstruction, that's our bad theology, that's our bad cultures, that's our bad, lots of baggage that got bound up in our faith that doesn't need to be there, that's been added on to our faith, that God starts stripping away over time. And so I think that's, one of the formative aspects of deconstruction is that, it's formative in the same way that suffering is formative. Because I think ultimately, deconstruction as a crisis is a form of suffering, even though it looks different than, it might look like curiosity and asking questions. But I think on an existential level, there is a level of suffering to it because of all the things you've lost trust in, of all the paradigms you had that you thought you could rely on, that you can't trust and rely on anymore. And so now you sort of start, Paul has this image in 1 Corinthians 3 of someone's house being caught up in flames, they'll experience that as suffering, he says. Think about what your experience would be like if your house caught on fire and everything that you had in it burned up. I think deconstruction is the spiritual analog of that. And so it's formative in very similar ways.
Right. Come out refined on the other side. So then when we turn to reconstruction, would you say that reconstruction is primarily an intentional decision to reconstruct something, or is it just kind of the next step as you walk through deconstruction and as you heal from grief and from the crisis of faith? Is reconstruction something that just kind of happens, or is it a chosen intentional path towards building something new?
Probably depends on the person, right? And how they're experiencing it. I think, again, to some level, reconstruction is inevitable. You will at some point somehow reconstruct something in its place. But I like to think about John Mark Comer kind of has this paradigm of intentional and unintentional spiritual formation, and he kind of has on the intentional spiritual formation side of things, you have teaching, community, spiritual disciplines, all kind of powered and fueled by the Holy Spirit. That's what you actually have control over. What you don't have control over on the low side of things actually is the hard knocks of life and suffering, kind of what we've been talking about. So I think there is a way to enter into reconstruction that is intentional in a way of and that's sort of what I ended up doing. It took a really long time for me to get there, but kind of saying I want different teaching in my life. I want different people in my life. I want to live my life a different way. And so I'm just going to kind of go see what I can find, see what works. But I think, if you don't enter into that, then you will still reconstruct something in its place, even unintentionally, right? So the reverse of a lot of those things, like instead of community, like intentional Christ-centered community, you just kind of have your friends, whoever they are, your friends, coworkers, just the people around you. instead of teaching, you just kind of have the stories and culture that you breathe, like the air that you breathe, and just kind of
Right.
pick up on.
Right.
Instead of your spiritual disciplines and practices, just habits, good and bad, that you pick up, that may or may not be helpful for you, may or may not be formative or deformative for you. You're not aware of them. They're just habits that you pick up, and instead of the Holy Spirit fueling all that, it's just the environments we find ourselves in, just wherever you might be, your job, your house, your family, your, whatever it is.
Everything.
And those things, whether you know it or not, start reconstructing and rebuilding you into a certain kind of
Right.
person
Right.
that may be closer or farther away from the character of Christ, but because it wasn't intentional, you weren't intentionally moving towards Christ in the first place. He doesn't have your heart and your affections the way that he has invited us into.
Yeah, and that's really what's at the heart of the podcast, is something, or really everything, is forming you. And so regardless of if you're in the best place in your life, your faith is stronger than ever, you're standing on the solid rock, or if you're in the middle of a crisis of faith, the things around us are forming us, our community, the teaching, the social media accounts we follow, everything that surrounds us is forming us, shaping us. But for the person who is either coming out of a season of deconstruction and looking to reconstruct intentionally, or for the pastor or the church leader or the friend who is walking through somebody through that, what are some intentional spiritual formational tools? What are some spiritual habits and disciplines that you think are most crucial to rebuilding a faith?
The first place I'd start is community, is
Yeah.
just the people that you're around, are the people that you're around, do they want you to be more like Christ or do they not? And you have to examine your own heart in that too. Is that something that you want, or is that something that you want to get away from? And there might be some part of you that wants to get away from that, and that's worth searching and exploring and figuring out why you feel that way, because there is a good chance that you were incredibly hurt in the environment that you were in to cause you to feel that way. And there's legitimacy in the pain. But it's worth questioning our own feelings, the stories that we're believing, just as closely as we're questioning and scrutinizing what we came from as well.
Right.
And so I would start with community. Just who are you around? Can you find a church that, even if you don't line up with every single thing that they believe on every single topic, that they can welcome you in your doubt, even if they hold conservative Orthodox doctrine, like I would hope they do? Can they still hold space for you and as you're processing the things that you're processing, and walk with you and not be threatened by you or scared by you, but want to, see you be able to search those things out in a environment that, is conducive for that. So I think community is the first place I would start, is just kind of examining the people who are around you. If you're a pastor listening to this, I'll tell a recent story. So I just got done a couple weeks ago with my church. We did a 3-week deconstruction equipping class forum at my church that I helped with, but a couple of my pastors also, we all worked around together as a group project. And man, that there's handful of people that came. It wasn't very large, but it was so impactful even for me, being able to talk through some of this stuff with people. And I've heard some great stories from that room as well. Just to kind of give you an idea of what we did. The first week was really me mainly just kind of presenting my kind of what we're talking about here, just kind of my thoughts on deconstruction. A lot of stuff that'll end up in the book. This isn't gonna, I'm not trying to turn this into like a buy my book type thing. It's not even written yet, but like a lot of stuff that's going to go in there, just kind of presenting a lot of this stuff to the people in the room. And that week was great because there was a friend of mine there who kind of at the end raised their hand and started crying and said, I have felt crazy. I have felt absolutely nuts. And I don't know if I'm losing my faith. I don't know if I'm trying to keep my faith. I just know, like, she's like, when you said crisis, it's that. Like, yes, I have questions. Yes, I'm thinking critically. Yes, but I can't sleep at night because this keeps me up, because I have to pass something on to my daughter now that I'm a parent, and I don't even know what I believe about any of this stuff. I don't know if it's real or not,
Yeah.
but
Wow.
I don't want to leave. I'm not trying to lose my faith. I want to stay, and so that was such a powerful moment. The second week we walked through, so kind of part of the way I think about it is, if it's a crisis that produces grief, then we actually walk through deconstruction the same way we walk through grief. And so, psychologists and therapists will talk about the 5 stages of grief. So that's denial, anger, bargaining, despair, acceptance. That is a very linear way of talking about it, and it is not a linear process at all. So what we did is, I actually did almost nothing. I had actually experienced a loss in my life the week of that class. And so I walked into that class not doing well. I walked into that class experiencing grief, and there I was, we were talking about grief. Thankfully, what we did in that week was we actually brought in our church's licensed therapist. She is a licensed grief counselor, and she did most of the talking, and it was some of the most healing stuff ever for the people in that room. Being able to talk about deconstruction through that lens of grief with a grief counselor. Really, we're not talking doctrine at all. We're not talking culture at all. We're just processing that experiential, existential part of it. And man, the feedback I heard from that was just absolutely incredible. And so if there's anything that I would recommend just for pastors to do, it's just bring it out into the light. Let's just talk about it, and don't make people feel scared. Don't make people feel crazy. Don't make people feel judged. Let's just talk about this. If you're questioning your faith, this is probably really, really scary for you. And we want you to know, like, we have questions about our faith, like we have in the past, so we've had to work through them. And like, you are in a very, you talk about spiritual formation, like this is a stage of the process, right? This is Israel in the wilderness crying out, why did you bring us out of Egypt just to die in the wilderness, right? I mean, this is just another phase that you don't know if you'll ever get to the promised land or not, but can we walk with you? Yeah. Can we just be in this with you, and help you process it? And you don't have to agree with us today. But like, let's just kind of walk with each other through it,
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And so I think that's a great thing for people to do. For churches to be able to do that, just to kind of bring it out to the light and have honest conversations about it and just address the reality of it. And I think the more we can be honest about the existential part of it, then we might be able to have more productive conversations about the nuts and bolts, right? About the beliefs, about the doctrines, about the culture, about, because you're getting trust of, like, hey, I don't think you're bad. I don't think you're crazy. I don't think you're trying to burn this whole place down. Like, I think you're wrestling through some really tough things that might be expressed in anger or despair, or, that are all valid ways of processing this. Let's just talk about it. So I hope we can have more environments like that in our churches, because I know when we did it, this is just a couple weeks ago, it was really great for us. If you're going through deconstruction, if you're the person actually going through it, it's tough, because what I don't want to do is like, oh, you're deconstructing, do these 5 things and you're going to be fine. Right. It's just like if someone loses their dad, it's like, oh, you're grieving. Oh, just do these things and you'll get over it. It's like, that's not how this works. Right. So I'm really wary to do that. What I would say is I would want to tell that person everything kind of that I just said, is that you're not crazy. You're not bad. You're not alone in this, that this is actually something that Christians have always done, maybe just with different language around it, whether that's, a crisis of faith or a dark night of the soul, or, the purgation stage of discipleship or whatever, And so there are other ways of thinking about this than, oh my gosh, I'm losing my faith,
Right.
And so I would I would want to encourage that person to, like I said before, think about their community, to think about the church that they're in, to think about the ways that they're even reading their Bibles. That if they might jettison one fundamentalist reading for another fundamentalist reading. I'll see that sometimes. I'll see really progressive Christians say something about the Bible, and I go, "Oh, you're reading that the exact same way a fundamentalist would read that, just with a different spin on it." Like I wouldn't read that the way either one of you read that, And so I think being able to take your time and just not feel like you have to rush into answers, not feeling like you have to read a verse and know what it means, or read a passage and just make up your mind on what that means. Like, you can take your time through this process. I think the Lord has patience for us. Jude says, "Have mercy on those who doubt," and I think the Lord has mercy to us when we doubt.
Yeah.
And so it is okay to, move 3 miles an hour, the speed of walking, just take your time and let the Lord do a work in you. That is scary, and your faith might look different on the other side of things, but I am convinced that the Lord is good in this process, and he's merciful to us in this process. So, it feels weird to say, do this, but like, two things that have been helpful for me. One, I tried to basically recreate my own theological and partially cultural reconstruction into a Spotify playlist. It's not perfect. There's even stuff that people say on the episodes, and I'm like, I don't agree with that, but the overall thing is worth it, and so I have put that. Nick, I can send you the link to it, and you can put it in the show notes or something like that. If people want to listen to that, it's over 100 hours. It'll take you a long time, and that's sort of the point. It kind of goes back to the take your time type thing.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to answer all your questions. It was never meant to, but if it can start reframing questions in ways that, I hadn't thought about it like that. I don't know if I agree, but that's, food for thought for me.
Worth thinking about. Yeah, right.
Right. So there's that. The other thing that I would say is, this is going to sound so millennial of me, but I have just found different forms and aspects of liturgy to be so, so helpful in my life.
Yeah.
So on a private note, what that has meant for me recently has been using a prayer book. And so I wish I was cool enough to use a Book of Common Prayer, and I don't know how it works. I'm not Anglican, so I have a lot of education that I need to have on the Book of Common Prayer. Every time I open it, it's very confusing to me. But one that I have found very helpful and easy to use is this book called Be Thou My Vision by Jonathan Gibson, published by Crossway, and it's much simpler to use and very, very good. Kind of walks you through basically a liturgy, almost like a worship service, but privately, right? You have a call to worship, you have a prayer of adoration, you have confession of sin, assurance of salvation, catechism, scripture reading, prayer, intercessory prayer, Lord's Prayer. It's been amazing privately. And then, corporately as a church, I don't know, my church's liturgy is the first time I've really gone to a liturgical church. We're Baptist. We're not Southern Baptist, but we are Baptist. So you wouldn't think we're that liturgical of a church, but we do have a pretty robust liturgy. And man, there was one week where it was like the songs were good, the sermon was good, but we corporately read Psalm 27 together, and I wept in my seat. And that is what the Lord spoke to me through. Because Psalm 27, I mean, there's lots of great things about that, but one of the things that it says in there is, though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will never leave me. And I was like, oh, that's my story in 2 lines. And I didn't come to church knowing that's what we're going to read today. I didn't know that was up next. But the Lord used that scripture to speak to me in that moment more than, a song or a sermon, even though my pastor is phenomenal and our worship team is incredible too. Right. And so all that to say, I think being able to find different spaces to where, the form of the church, the form of the liturgy, is maybe has more opportunities for the Lord to speak to you than maybe what some seeker-sensitive churches would provide for you, or some other environments would provide for you that a lot of us have been raised in, because there is a rich history there that I think we can tap into that doesn't require us ditching the Orthodox beliefs that actually hold our faith up.
For sure. Well, Ian, this has been so helpful, and my prayer is that this conversation will be balm to somebody's soul in the midst of a crisis of faith. So thank you for joining us today. Tell us where we can find you. Where are you online? Where are you writing? And tell us a little bit about when your book's coming out.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter way too much, so just at Ian Harber. You can follow me there. My Substack, ianharber.substack.com. One day I'll buy a real domain name for that, but that's what it is for now. The book, so I'm so early in the process writing it, it's going to be a while before it's out. It'll be sometime next year, 2024. But yeah, so it'll be out. It's through InterVarsity Press. If you follow me on Twitter or Substack, you'll hear about it. But yeah, so that's where it's coming out.
Great. Well, we will gratefully look forward to that and gratefully take in all the wisdom that you shared with us today. So thank you so much for being here, and to all of our listeners, thank you for joining us on the Living Room Disciple.
You have been listening to the Living Room Disciple podcast, and we are glad that you are here. Throughout the month of March, we are excited to introduce you and others to this brand new endeavor. However, we will be taking the month of April off, so please make sure to subscribe to this podcast so that way you'll hear us in your feeds in May. In fact, we're taking the month off to figure out how to do this even better. There's a survey that we'd love for you to take in the show notes to give us feedback. And also, don't forget to rate the pod. Throughout the month of March, Nick and myself are excited to bring to you 5 different conversations. 3 of them will be between Nick and myself, talking about spiritual formation around things like hell and damnation and the idea of living room discipleship. The other 2 weeks, we'll each be interviewing people who are deeply formative for us, and we're excited to introduce you to them. Huge shout out to our production staff, Anissa Live, and to our marketing manager, Eric Church. Thank you so much for all the work you do. This is a production of the Living Room Disciple Media, and we're glad you're here.